minutes long. Last semester I took a sabbatical to work on a book project I was starting involving modern Gnosticism. And that project is sort of what I want to talk about today. Since I was asked about this by a couple of people when I returned in August, I should probably warn you that I did not research, write, and publish a 300-page book in the 16 weeks that I had off on my sabbatical. This is going to be a long-term project. When I was at the University of Illinois getting my PhD, there were two different professors who each I knew who each took 20 years to work on an individual book project, and both of those book projects became major works in the field. I don't know if I'll be working on this for the next 19 years, and I really doubt it'll be a major work in the field, but I would like to talk with you today a little bit about a work in progress. And I should also warn you, this is a work in its inception. I'm still figuring these things out. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is not going to be very much at all like one of my classroom lectures. It's going to be a lot more tentative, a lot less student-friendly than a regular lecture. I actually picked the awful title I picked to try to sort of steer students off because I don't know how student-friendly this is going to be. I think for a lot of people, what I'll talk about for about the next 50 minutes might possibly be both boring and incomprehensible. So you get a twofer today. It's common for people to bring food to Friday forums. I hope you did. At least you'll get something out of this. There we go. I screwed them up. Okay. Now, all right, Gnosticism. What I want to talk about today is actually a fairly large topic covering about 2,000 years of history. So what I want to do today is to provide you with some historical background. Now, specifically, I am interested in modern Gnosticism in the 20th century down to today. I want to write a book about that and tie it in with a current movement in religion known as the New Age. I would like to write a book about that, connecting Gnosticism with that. But I don't think modern Gnosticism would make a lot of sense to you if you didn't have a historical background on the topic, okay? So what I'm going to do today is first explain what type of history it is that looks at religious ideas, why I, as a historian, feel that I'm able to do this, and I'll give you a broad overview of Gnosticism down to the medieval period, and maybe at some future date, a couple of years from now, after I've done a little bit more work on this, I might give another Friday forum on modern Gnosticism, which actually I'm going to try to write the book about, okay? Now, first, let's deal with a question that might arise. Why am I, as a historian, interested in a religious movement called Gnosticism? Aren't you historians supposed to study dead presidents and the wars they fought? Why are you messing with religion? Well, there are two branches of history that I'm interested in personally. One is intellectual history, and the other is the history of ideas. Okay, the history of ideas is pretty simple to understand. It just takes one big central idea and traces it across a long historical span. Some people might have heard of a book called The Great Chain of Being by Owen Lovejoy. It's a history of ideas, a history of that particular idea. Okay? Intellectual history, which is one of the fields I was trained in at the University of Illinois, also known as intellectual and cultural history, looks at intellectuals and their ideas and tries to connect them with specific events of their times and put them in their cultural and historical context to show not only how the ideas grew up in specific periods, but how the ideas that these folks formulated shaped the periods that they lived in. So people who do intellectual history have to be familiar with a wide variety of fields: science, religion, philosophy, literature, and you try to have a holistic picture of how all these different disciplines fit together and shape larger historical patterns. But the danger with that is it means you become sort of an intellectual trespasser, and you have to sort of trespass into fields where there are specialists who feel very protective of those fields that you're trespassing into. And I think there will be a little bit of that today. So with that in mind, let me try to talk about the ideas I'm researching. Ideas connected with multiple religious movements stretching out over 2,000 years. Talk a little bit about Gnosticism, and I'd like to start out with a story. December of 1945, a couple months after World War II ended, there was a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman, and he was exploring a cave near a place called Nag Hammadi. Nag Hammadi is an Egyptian town on the west bank of the Nile River. And he and his brothers were there, and they were looking for a special type of soil that they used on their farm as a fertilizer. And he was digging around in this cave looking for this soil, and they unearthed this red clay jar. And they got it out of the ground, and it was about 3.5 feet high. And he said he immediately wanted to crack it open in hopes that there would be gold inside this big jar. But he said he held back because he'd also heard stories about what else could be in jars like that. It could be filled with genies or jinns. So he held back. And when he finally did crack open the jar, both of his fears came true, at least metaphorically. He found inside that big jar 13 leather binders called codices, and they contained papyrus documents from 3rd century CE. And these documents in that big clay jar were all related to Gnosticism, a religious movement that had flourished in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century CE. But until that discovery, they were almost known exclusively through attacks made on Gnosticism by church fathers. Okay? So these documents, obviously an academic gold mine, but they also let loose a genie, the spirit of Gnosticism. The only Christian heresy that reappears over and over again throughout Christian history. A couple of weeks ago, I asked one of my colleagues, Dr. Jeffries, if he could agree with that statement, that Gnosticism is the only Christian heresy that reappears over and over again throughout Christian history. He says, probably true, but it also would depend on how you define Gnosticism. Okay? So let's take a look at what that term means and how scholars define it. Gnosis is Greek for knowledge, and a Gnostic is one who knows. Plato seems to have coined this term around 400 BC and BCE, excuse me. And obviously, it seems a little bizarre and exotic today, mainly because people who use the term today refuse to translate it out of the original Greek. If you accuse someone of being a Gnostic in search of gnosis, that can sound fairly sinister, at least out of the ordinary, which to some people amounts to the same thing. It doesn't quite have the same effect when instead you accuse someone of being a knower, a guy who knows stuff, one who seeks knowledge. Freak me out, right? And in fact, the terms Gnostic and Gnosis were used in the ancient world, but the term Gnosticism never was. The term Gnosticism was actually specifically coined in the 1680s by an English theologian at Cambridge, a man named Henry Moore, and he coined it mainly to insult other Christian theologians he disagreed with. And before these discoveries at Nag Hammadi, Henry Moore's term Gnosticism was mainly used as a pejorative nickname by Protestant theologians. And in the sense that they used it, it was sort of an erudite insult for someone who claims to have some hidden knowledge that that person doesn't actually have. Okay? Now, the original Gnostics, the ones from the 2nd and 3rd centuries of Christianity, what did they believe in? Well, as it turns out, there's no easy answer to that question. In my History 118 class, the second part of my American History survey, the first full class, I go over what I call basic terms that we're going to be using for the rest of the semester, big terms like capitalism, socialism, communism, and I tell students that from the 20th century on, one of the things you have to deal with is an increasingly large number of really big, important words that have ism stepped attached to the end of them. And I tell my students that one of the most irritating things for me about all these ism words you have to deal with is, in most cases, there is no standard agreed upon definition for these terms. And the same thing actually turns out to be true of Gnosticism. Okay? Now, since gnosis means knowledge, and a Gnostic is one who knows, everyone can pretty much agree that Gnosticism involved obtaining hidden knowledge that would somehow save you or redeem you. Okay? But as to just what that knowledge consisted of, scholars disagree. 1966, this is about 21 years after the Nag Hammadi discoveries, there was an international conference in Messina. And there was one goal to this international conference, to come up with a working definition of Gnosticism that most scholars could agree on. So they got together and they decided that the idea of hidden knowledge that could bring salvation was a trait that was found in too many other religions to be uniquely Gnostic. So they settled on two key features. Okay? Number one, the idea that people have a divine spark in them that must be reawakened. And number two, what they called the downward movement of the divine. The downward movement of the divine. That's the idea that God came from some other realm to reawaken the divine spark in humanity so it could return to the realm it came from. Okay? They also pointed out that Gnostics see human history as a process of de-evolution. De-evolution. In their system, in their worldview, the divine comes into this world from another better realm and becomes corrupted by this material world and has to be rescued. Okay? Now, since then, there have been two major scholars, Williams and King, who have written two major books claiming that Gnosticism is a category that is so broadly applied to so many different groups that it is effectively meaningless and should not be used anymore, at least for early church history. Okay? Other scholars try to provide what are called ideal types or typological models. An ideal type, in Max Weber's sense, is a broad outline of features that, while possibly not matching any specific case exactly, can be applied to a broad array of types. And of these, the most complete typological model, smiling because I mentioned your hero Max Weber, is a German scholar named Markschies, Christoph Markschies. He's got a typological model with 8 features for Gnosticism. And I thought, going through his 8-part typological model, these abstract features, and trying to give you some concrete, specific examples, might be a good way for me to sort of introduce you to this concept. So I will do this. I will go through his abstract features and try to give you some specific examples where needed. Okay, feature 1 of his 8-part model, the experience of a completely otherworldly, distant, supreme God. Okay, that is a pretty simple one, easy to understand. This figure in Gnosticism is sometimes called the God behind God, or the alien God, sometimes the one true God. Okay? Feature number 2, the introduction, which is conditioned by this, of further divine figures, or the splitting up of existing figures into figures that are closer to human beings than to the remote supreme God. Okay? Now, these features are translated out of German, and that definitely reads like something that has been translated out of German. Okay? Intermediate semi-divine figures. There's a lot of them in these different Gnostic systems. And some of the ancient systems, these in-between deities, when they are evil, and they usually are evil in Gnosticism, are called archons. And to put this in terms that modern academics here at CMU can understand, I've sort of formulated a little Gnostic fairy tale. In our universe, there are evil and crazed archons, known in popular terms as the administrators, or the administration. And these demonic archon administrators are in continual war with the children of light, also known as the faculty. And these demonic archon administrators, in their insane quest for world domination, fear above all else the power of the faculty to bring gnosis to their students. They block it wherever they can. Okay? So that's a CMU Gnostic area. I'm glad you're laughing, you know I'm joking. Some of my best friends are semi-demonic. Now, not all of these semi-divine figures are evil in Gnosticism. In Gnostic mythology, there is a very positive female figure called Sophia, who's the personification of wisdom. Okay? Feature 3. The estimation of the world and matter as evil creation, and an experience conditioned by this of the alienation of the Gnostic and the modern world. Okay? Gnostics generally have the feeling that all of us, even the worst of us, are better than this world that we've been born into. A common Gnostic idea is, I am in this world, but not of this world. I am in this world, but not of this world. And obviously, when you bring in the term alienation, you introduce one of the key concepts of modern history. The first great 20th century work on Gnosticism was written by a man named Hans Jonas, and he was a student of Martin Heidegger, and he drew explicit parallels between ancient Gnosticism and 20th century existentialist philosophy. But the Gnostics went much further with their alienation than the existentialists or these other groups. Most groups who feel alienated from the world will sometimes go as far as to take the radical step of rejecting the ideological constructs that their society is based on. The Gnostics tended to try to reject material reality itself, as though that were some sort of ideological construct that they could choose to reject by refusing to believe in. Okay? Feature 4, the introduction of a distinct creator god or assistant. Within the Platonic tradition, he is called the craftsman. In Greek, demiurgos, the demiurge, translated into English, sometimes described as merely ignorant, but sometimes also as evil. Okay? Many Gnostics specifically identified the God of the Old Testament as this demiurge, this inferior God. And in particular, they had a problem with him cursing Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden for seeking knowledge. And in some modern Gnostic churches, and there are modern Gnostic churches all over the world, Eve is a saint. She's the first Gnostic. And in one Gnostic myth, Sophia, the embodiment of wisdom, disguises herself as a serpent, and she hides out in the Garden of Eden so she can bring gnosis to Eve and trick the demiurge, or the creator god. This type of biblical interpretation is technically called inverse exegesis. It is a fancy term for taking a standard interpretation of a story and turning it on its head. And in general, it's sort of typical of Gnostic hermeneutics from this early period. Okay? Now, feature 5, the explanation of this state of affairs by a mythological drama in which a divine element that falls from its sphere into an evil world slumbers in human beings of one class as a divine spark that can be freed from this. Okay? There's a beautiful passage in a Gnostic poem called the Hymn of the Pearl, where the narrator, after having achieved gnosis, says, "And then I remembered that I was a son of kings, and my free soul longed for its own kind. And then I remembered that I was a son of kings, and my free soul longed for its own kind." Now, this feature here mentions mythological dramas. They're all very, very complicated, and I just want to give you one example out of many possible examples I can give you of a Gnostic mythological drama. Okay? Sophia, that is divine wisdom, the feminine aspect of the God beyond God, gives birth to the demiurge. Okay, but she's a hard luck mom because her kid soon goes insane. He goes insane and he begins to think that he is the one true God. And to prove it, he creates the universe and the archons to govern it. And almost as an afterthought, he creates these groveling, worm-like creatures called humans. Well, Sophia looks down and feels pity for these worm-like humans, and she blows sparks of herself into them to try to save them. Okay? But these sparks become trapped in this inferior material world. So Sophia has to descend herself into this terrible world to try to rescue the humans, but she herself becomes trapped in material reality. And it's only the entrance of the male aspect of the divine in the form of Christ that can save Sophia and the human race. So the reuniting of Sophia and Christ in this myth is described as a quote-unquote marriage that took place in a bridal chamber. Okay? That's one version of the mythological drama of Gnosticism. There are many others. Okay? Feature 6. Knowledge, gnosis, about this state, which, however, is only gained through a redeemer figure who descends from the other world and ascends to it again. Okay? Ancient Gnostics, like a lot of modern Gnostics, very fond of Jesus. They thought that Jesus was a representative sent into this world by the God beyond God. But a lot of them, especially in the beginning of Gnosticism, 2nd and 3rd centuries, interpreted him in ways that the traditional church could not accept and labeled as heresy. Okay? A lot of the early Gnostics believed in something that was called Docetism. Okay, Docetism is the belief that there was a virtual Jesus walking around, that his material body was sort of an illusion. One Gnostic, Marcion, has an extended passage where he says that Jesus only pretended to eat meals like that Last Supper because he actually had no digestive tract. Okay? Now, the major problems with Docetism come when you say that the crucifixion was an illusion. And this was an especially acute problem at the time, the 2nd and 3rd centuries, because Christianity was still illegal and martyrs were undergoing torture in public arenas to stand up for their beliefs. And when they went into these public theaters to be stripped naked and tortured with heated pliers and things like that, they were under the impression that they were following in Christ's footsteps. Okay, but you have one Gnostic source that actually has Jesus showing up at his own crucifixion, standing there in the crowd and laughing. Yes, laughing at these dumb Romans who are crucifying a phantom. Okay? Feature 7. The redemption of human beings through the knowledge of that God or spark of God in them. And it's pretty easy to understand. And finally, feature 8. A tendency toward dualism and different types, which can express itself in the concept of God in the opposition of spirit and matter and in anthropology. Okay? Dualism is basically pitting ultimate good, pure good against pure evil. Dualism in anthropology I don't think is as clear as it possibly should be. When he's talking about dualism in anthropology, he's talking about Gnostics who see themselves as being at war with their own bodies. Okay? And the Gnostic worldview, your spirit is pure, your spiritual desires are good, your body is evil. Okay? It's part of this evil material realm, and your bodily desires are evil. You're at war with your own body. You have a dualist conception of anthropology. But the most common type of dualism in Gnosticism is the dualism that pits the evil creator God of this world with the God beyond God. Okay? The true God who has to send cryptic messengers and unlikely messiahs into this fallen material realm. Okay? So those are the 8 features of that typological model. And once again, that's what social scientists call an ideal type. No one particular Gnostic movement is going to contain all those features. Most of them won't contain quite a few. Now other scholars limit their typological models just to 1 or 2 tricks. One of them, a major scholar, Marjanine, says that Gnosticism involves only 2 things. Number 1, an ignorant, inferior God who doesn't understand the real God. And number 2, a human soul with a spark from the true God and an ability to return to the realm of God by gaining knowledge. Okay, for her, that's it. Just those 2 things. Okay? Another major scholar, Marvin Meyer, goes back to what they all rejected at Messina, at the Messina conference, and he says Gnosticism is defined by hidden mystical knowledge that has salvific powers. Okay? Most scholars today, no matter which aspects they choose to emphasize, no longer tend to speak of one Gnostic religion. They speak more of Gnostic tendencies, Gnostic types of religion. Okay? So why did I do this? Why did I just torture you with all this typology, all these different opinions about Gnosticism? Well, obviously, if you're going to write a book about this, being able to define your central term is sort of an important thing. I spent a lot of time this year going through these scholarly controversies, and it was really important for me to get a clear sense of the controversies and to realize that there is no one hard and fast definition of Gnosticism with a capital G that all scholars agree on. And in some ways, I don't think that would ever be possible, because Gnosticism, and here I might add my own typological trait, not currently found in the literature on the subject, Gnosticism, whatever else it involves really highly personal visions, usually expressed in private symbols. For those of you familiar with modern literature, some Gnostic documents, especially from the early years, read almost like symbolist poetry, French symbolist poetry from the 19th century. And this brings me to another important problem connected with this project, that is, how do historians deal with religious visions and experiences? What does a professional historian do with that sort of material? Okay? Now, when you deal with subjects as an historian, you're supposed to rely on empirical evidence, things that you can verify with your senses. But you have a problem with religion, because when you're dealing with religion, you're dealing with subjects who have individual religious visions, and they're all usually claiming contact with some non-empirical force, or forces, okay? So the typical move made by most historians is to assume that your subjects are either lying or deluded. Okay, they're confused. What's really motivating your subjects is economic pressure, political turmoil, status anxiety, things like that. There's a famous quote from the sociologist, our friend Max Weber, that historians of religion like to cite, and I quote, "Any need for redemption is the expression of a quote-unquote need, and social or economic expression is by no means the only source of its origin, though of course very important." Okay? Now, of course, people who take that reductionist approach are open to being called Gnostics in the pejorative sense that I mentioned earlier. They're claiming to have a hidden knowledge that they don't actually possess. They're in effect saying to their subjects, you claim that you responded to some spiritual force that changed your life, but I know what really happened to you. What you've actually been responding to is the fact that you work for minimum wage in a dead-end job, and you live in a trailer park, and you can't support your kids, and that bothers you, okay? These economic anxieties create your religious delusions, okay? Now, for me, personally, not only is that insufferably arrogant, but it's dumb. I mean, you can teach an intelligent 8th grader to apply that formula. Religion equals economics. Religion equals politics. Okay, it's not a very hard thing to do. And most importantly, it doesn't tell you anything interesting about your subject that you're studying. Okay? When I look as a historian at religious visionaries like the Gnostics, I tend to take a clue from the great psychoanalyst Carl Jung. Carl Jung, as a part of his job, listened to stories of people who had been confined to mental institutions, and he asked them to tell about their experiences. And after a while, he tried to respect these stories that they were telling them. He said, well, when someone comes to me and claims to have had some sort of psychic experience that seems improbable, I can't dismiss that and tell that person that he's deluded. For most of these people, these experiences that they're talking about are very, very real to them. He said, the most I can say to someone like that is, well, you claim to have had this particular experience. I myself have never had that experience, but let's talk a little bit more about your experience and how it fits into the context of your life. And that's what I try to do as a historian looking at religious visionaries. I try to take them on their own terms and see how they fit their visions into the qualitative context of their lives and their times. Okay? At any rate, with this particular religion, with Gnosticism, standard methodology of reducing religious visions, the byproduct of economic, social, political changes, it can never, ever work. Why? Well, this is a religion that has repeatedly appeared for over 2,000 years in different regions, different times, and in radically different economic, political, and social circumstances. Quick overview. Gnosticism as a religion, or a religious tendency, has flourished in the ancient Mediterranean, the ancient Middle East, that is Persia, today called Iran, Central Asia, in ancient China, the medieval Balkans, medieval France, and more recently today, it's a flourishing, or at least a viable movement in 20th century America, Europe, and Australia. You want to connect those together with an economic or a social pattern? Feel free to try it. Tell me how that works out for you. Okay? So now that we have some general idea of what Gnosticism means as a belief system, let me try to give you a short history of it up to the medieval period. Okay? When you look at the origins of Gnosticism, how this stuff started, guess what? You step into another scholarly quagmire. I actually wanted to take you into this quagmire, but I'm not going to have time. I'm just going to summarize it, okay? Gnosticism is a major religious movement. Series of related movements arose in the early church, 2nd and 3rd century CE. There is no scholarly agreement whatsoever about where this started. Some scholars trace it back to ancient Persia and an older religion called Zoroastrianism, because Zoroastrianism is a really dualist religion. The Gnostics are dualists. Some people trace it back to ancient India, some documents called the Upanishads. Some scholars say it was Jewish. There's an entire book that spent 600 pages saying it was definitely a Christian doctrine that arose out of Christianity. No agreement. Okay? At any rate, whether or not it grew from inside Christianity, Gnosticism was seen as a viable form of Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd century CE. And there are a number of charismatic teachers who formed Gnostic churches, international Gnostic churches, Gnostic Christian schools of thought. And not a lot is known about these different teachers or schools. In many cases, and it's a really depressing thing, we just have names of the teachers. We have fragments of their writings, maybe 2 or 3 pages of their writings, someone who might have written 50 volumes over a lifetime, and scattered references to what these people believed, primarily written by their enemies, the church fathers. Okay? So here we come back to our friend Muhammad Ali and his discovery at Nag Hammadi. Before those codices were discovered, almost all that we knew of Gnosticism came from one really big book by an early church father who opposed the Gnostics. Around 180 CE, a Christian bishop named Irenaeus wrote a huge 5-volume work called Conviction and Refutation of Gnosis, Wrongly So Called. And as that title indicates, this is a systematic attack on Gnosticism. And as scholars, we don't normally try to learn about a religion by reading attacks made on it by its enemies. Imagine trying to learn about Judaism by reading Nazi pamphlets. You wouldn't get a very accurate picture, okay? But for about 1,500 years, Irenaeus is almost our only major source about Gnosticism. There was one other, as a professional pagan philosopher, Plotinus. He had his own Neoplatonic school. He interacted with and argued with the Gnostics in debates on a regular basis, and he found the Gnostics to be really, really irritating people. And he wrote a short attack on them from a philosophical perspective called Against Those Who Affirm that the Creator of the Cosmos and the Cosmos itself are evil, sometimes known as Against the Gnostics. Okay? So you had 2 attacks, one big one relatively short one, by intellectual opponents, not much else to go on. Then comes the discovery at Nag Hammadi. Okay? So after he cracked open the big clay jar, what's in the big clay jar? Well, Muhammad Ali claimed that he found 13 big leather folders, and these are called the codices. And each codice contained papyrus documents, many papyrus documents and fragments. And they were written in Coptic, which is a late form of Egyptian written in Greek characters. The Egyptians added 6 new characters to represent Egyptian sounds not represented in the original Greek alphabet. So Muhammad Ali had these big leather binders. What did they do with them? Well, they took them back to his house, and he sort of dumped them on his kitchen floor. His mom used at least one complete codice and part of another as kindling to light her kitchen stove. And eventually, Muhammad and his brothers got into a little dispute with one of their neighbors. And in the course of this dispute, he and his brothers killed a man, cut out his heart, and divided it into pieces, and they ate it. Okay? Well, apparently this sort of behavior is frowned upon in Egypt, so there's a little murder investigation, and in the course of the investigation they found these documents in his kitchen. Okay? So they began going up for sale internationally. One was purchased by the Jung Institute in Zurich, Switzerland, and today it's known as the Jung Codex. Okay? And Carl Jung was definitely a modern 20th century Gnostic. He considered himself to be a Gnostic well before Nag Hammadi. Okay? So when the documents reached the scholarly community, 52 documents left that had been burned by his mom. 6 of these are copies, repeats. Okay? So you have 46 documents or tracts, and these are sometimes called the Gnostic scriptures, and they were written down in Coptic around 250 to 350 CE. And we can tell that by carbon dating these leather binders. And they were all translations of Greek sources written earlier. So now we have 46 documents from at least some of the people that Irenaeus attacked. And not a complete record of Gnosticism by any means. There's still entire Gnostic movements and international schools that flourished for longer than our country has been in existence, where once again, all we have are the names of the leaders, fragments of their writings, and attacks by church fathers. But we do have these 46 documents from Nag Hammadi. What are they? Well, most of them are really strange, really obscure, very difficult for modern people to read and understand. At least one of these documents with the cryptic title, Perfect Thunder, Perfect Mind, is not recognizably Christian, Jewish, or Gnostic. As a matter of fact, I think you could probably really comfortably place it in an anthology of Zen Buddhist writings. Okay, it's mainly called Gnostic because 15 centuries earlier, someone just happened to stick it in that jar that was buried at Nag Hammadi. Now, one of the major questions of this period is the relationship between these documents and what came to be called the New Testament. And this is a very contentious, difficult subject, and I am not really very well qualified to talk about it, especially since I don't read Greek, I don't read Coptic. I talked with Dr. Jeffries this morning in the hallways, and I was worried about even touching on this, because he's an expert on this and I'm not. But I would like to briefly touch upon one Gnostic document from Nag Hammadi that's related to this problem, and it's the Gospel of Thomas. And in private conversations, I've talked with people who say, what? They say, well, you say it's really hard to read these documents. If I was going to read one of them, just out of curiosity, which one should I read? I said, well, read the Gospel of Thomas. It's very important. So let's talk about this. The Gospel of Thomas, a document discovered at Nag Hammadi, begins, and I quote, "These are the secret sayings that the twin Judas Thomas recorded." And then follows 113 sayings of Jesus, most of which are already found in the New Testament, some of which never been heard before, at least for about 15 centuries. And almost each saying is introduced by a formula. Jesus said, and the saying. He said, the saying. No narrative, it's a little book of quotations, about 20 pages long. Okay? So, the sayings collection of Jesus is by far the most important of these Nag Hammadi documents, and it's important because it seems to be a document that scholars had previously speculated existed. Okay? And this hypothetical document is connected with what New Testament scholars call the synoptic problem. And I am not qualified at all to talk in any kind of detail about the synoptic problem because it involves really close philological analysis of the Greek in these documents. But I'll just give a dumbed-down version. Okay? You have 4 Gospels in the beginning of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay? And these 4 Gospels, for the most part, tell us everything that we know about the life of Jesus on earth. Okay? Now, of these 4 Gospels, one, John, the Gospel of John, is sui generis. I mean, it's in a class by itself. It's very different from the other 3. But the first 3 of these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have so many similarities that they're called the Synoptic Gospels. And at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries, scholars developed special theory about how these first 3 Gospels fit together. And the theory is that the shortest of these Gospels, Mark, was probably written first. It was probably written maybe about 30 years after Jesus was crucified, maybe in CE 66 or so, when the Romans are starting to fight for control of Jerusalem. And Mark, really short little gospel, is what you call an action gospel. It concentrates on Jesus running around and doing things immediately. okay? The word immediately is used 36 times and 678 verses. That's 1/3 of the time you see that word in the entire New Testament, okay? And the action in Mark is pretty much found word for word in Matthew and Luke, okay? Of the 678 verses of Mark, 600 of them are found repeated almost word for word in Matthew, 300 in Luke, okay? But in addition, in Matthew and Luke, sayings of Jesus are added to these action narratives, okay? And these sayings are in places repeated word for word as if they were quoted from a written source and not from oral tradition, okay? So scholars speculated there must have been some sort of saying source, some little book of the sayings of Jesus that disappeared at some point, contained primarily the teachings of Jesus. And then Matthew and Luke, when they drew up their Gospels, they turned to Mark for the action, and they turned to this lost saying source for the teachings, okay? 1890, a German scholar named Weiss first called this speculative lost gospel Q, okay? Q is short for Quella, a German word for source. Actually, the word that he was thinking of was Reddenquella, or saying source, and no one was sure why Weiss called it Q instead of R, but he did, so we're stuck with it. At any rate, that will be on the final, so write it down, okay? Q, not R. Very simple, right? So when the Gospel of Thomas was discovered at Nag Hammadi, first thing they noticed was this little sayings collection. They said, this must be the Q source that we've been looking for all these years. Okay, we've been speculating about this since the 19th century, as most of the material found in Matthew and Luke, in addition to these unknown sayings. And these unknown sayings that are found in this little Gospel of Thomas give you a different take on Christianity, and they show you that Christianity could have developed in different directions, okay? One of the sayings that's usually interpreted as Gnostic is, if you bring forth that which is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth that which is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Okay, most people, some people at least, look upon that as almost an early form of psychoanalysis, which is one of the many reasons why people like Jung were very interested in the Gnostics. At any rate, the relationship of Thomas to the rest of the New Testament is still a matter of debate. There's a big literature on this, as is the question of Gnostic references in the rest of the New Testament. I will give you two little examples here. A great German theologian, Rudolf Bultmann, wrote a gigantic commentary on the Gospel of John, 1941. This is 4 years before Nag Hammadi. And in that book, which I understand scholars still find to be fairly respectable, he claimed that the Gospel of John was just permeated with Gnostic ideas, and that the author of the Gospel of John was a quote-unquote Christianized Gnostic. More recently, Princeton philosopher Elaine Pagels wrote a best-selling book called Beyond Belief, and her thesis in that book was that the Gospel of John was actually written in response to that Gospel of Thomas found in Nag Hammadi, and that the figure of doubting Thomas in the Gospel of John, the one who won't believe in the risen Christ until he can actually stick his finger into the spear wound, that's a caricature of the Gospel of the Thomas who wrote the Gospel of Thomas, the one who insists on gnosis rather than taking things on faith. Okay? Anyway, the Gnostics were definitely in the mix, early Christianity, in the first 3 centuries. At the end of the 3rd century, a religious visionary named Mani, who was raised in a sort of a semi-Gnostic cult, took Gnostic ideas, combined them with more traditional Christian ideas, as well as some ideas of Buddha, Zoroaster, and he created a new world religion that for a couple hundred years was actually the most popular religion on the planet. This is Manichaeism. Okay? This is the only Gnostic religion that ever became a world religion. Okay? Mani's dates are 216 to 277. Okay? So this is a syncretistic religion, and it presented itself in different places under different guises. In the West, Mani presented himself as sort of a new type of Christ, and this was sold as the new true form of Christianity. It became dominant for a period in Persia, today called Iran. Mani converted the king of Persia, Shapur I, to this doctrine. And Mani's followers then took this religion, they spread it along the Silk Road to as far as China. In China, Manichaeism was a popular religion until the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century. Scholars can actually find references to this religion in China as late as the 17th century. And I believe China has today what is the only surviving fragment of a Manichaean temple. And there's an inscription, a partial inscription, that refers to the Buddha Mani. So apparently in China he was sold as the true Buddha, okay, or presented to his followers. Greatest theologian in the history of Christianity, St. Augustine, had his introduction to Christianity through Manichaeism. Okay? Became a low-level member of that church. And at the time when he joined that movement, he thought it was the best form of Christianity. After he left it to join the Catholic Church, he wrote many works attacking it. Okay? Another offshoot of Gnosticism is a Jewish mystical tradition called the Kabbalah. Now, the great scholar of the Kabbalah, Gershom Scholem, always referred to Kabbalah as Jewish Gnosticism. And if you look at the New Age, which I like to do in this book project, you have to look at magic, and most modern magicians, people who really believe in that stuff, work with systems that are in one way or another connected with the Kabbalah. At least that's my Muggle perspective. Okay? So the Kabbalah, a Jewish mystical tradition, sort of solidified in Europe in the 10th and 11th centuries at the same time that another Gnostic religion appeared in the Byzantine Empire in the form of another religion called Boga Mills. Boga Mills. Okay? The Boga Mills, who were they? They were dualists who believed that the creator God of this world was evil and that all matter was an evil illusion. Okay? They were centered in Bulgaria, and at one point this Gnostic religion had spread throughout most of the Byzantine Empire. It was spreading like wildfire. Entire regions of the empire were going Boga Mill. Okay? So the Boga Mills were eventually defeated in a way that reads like a scene from Hamlet. Okay? Byzantine Emperor Alexis Comnenus I pretended that he was really interested in this hot new religion, Boga Millism, and he passed the word around that he wanted to be converted. So he invited the leader of the Boga Mills, and then in Basil, into his royal palace to discuss his conversion. But in the room where they met, he had a huge hanging tapestry, and behind that tapestry he stationed all of the top church, political, and military leaders of the Byzantine Empire. And after he got Basil to explain his doctrines and tried to convert him, he suddenly threw back the tapestry and introduced them and said, "By your very words, you have convicted yourself. Take him away." Okay? And Basil was led away to be tortured and publicly burned. But from the Balkans, Boga Millism spread to southern France, to a region called Elbe. And the last major outbreak of Gnosticism I will cover today, we're almost done, appeared there. Gnostics in Languedoc called themselves the Cathars. And we can trace the contact between the Boga Mills and the Cathars directly. We know that they were in communication with each other. Okay? The Cathars, like the Boga Mills, were radical dualists, and they viewed the entire created world as an evil illusion. By the way, the Cathars, there's some debate about this, the Cathars seem to have invented a deck of fortune-telling cards, still popular in New Age people, that they call the Tarot. There's a whole literature on this little deck of cards, the Tarot. Now, it's hard to say what else they believe because the church destroyed most, but not all, of their writings. We have some interesting interrogation transcripts of the Inquisition for the ones who survived to be interrogated, and they all said that they were the true Christians and that they were purifying the church. Now, at the time that this heresy was spreading, St. Dominic, the other leaders of the church who attacked them, they didn't really know what to make of these Cathars. So they looked to the writings of St. Augustine, attacking the Manichaees. And those writings at that point were over 700 years old, and they started to call the Cathars the new Manichaees. From what I understand, as late as the 1500s, at the beginning of the Protestant Revolution, Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther is being referred to as a Manichaean heretic. It becomes just a catchphrase in the church for crazy heretic. Okay? So, as the Cathars began to take over region after region, southern France and parts of Italy, church used not only this newly created thing called the Inquisition to attack them, but the Pope called for for military volunteers. He went to war over this in what came to be called the Albigensian Crusade. It's called that because the region where the Cathars were located was Albi. Papal army was put into the field, and they started attacking these Cathar strongholds. Cathars, among the Cathars were some of the leading members of the French nobility. This is a war that the Pope fought against these folks for over 20 years, okay? From 1209 to 1229. The final siege was of a castle fortress at the top of a mountain, a place called Chateau de Montségur. And it was a military operation, and at the end of it, hundreds of Cathar men, women, and children were led down that mountain in chains, and they were burned alive by the Inquisition. Because of a Hollywood action film called 300, most people are familiar with the sort of suicidal stand that King Leonidas and his 300 Spartan soldiers made against the entire Persian army at a place called Thermopylae. 20th century British novelist Lawrence Durrell wrote a really interesting Gnostic novel, partially about the Cathars, and he called the last stand of the Cathars at Montségur the Thermopylae of the Gnostic soul. The Thermopylae of the Gnostic soul. Okay? So most people thought that after the Albigensian Crusade, Gnosticism would never be seen again in this world. But as I said, in 1945, the genie was once again let loose, and there's been a small, but I think very influential, very interesting group of 20th century figures involved with, or in one way connected with, Gnosticism. And that's what I would like to write about, and what I've talked about today will be sort of background for that larger project. Okay? So at the beginning of this talk, if you weren't here, I promised two things. I promised I would be both A, boring, and B, incomprehensible. I think I've been as good as my word. I thank you for putting yourself through this, and I'm sorry you missed your lunch to go through this. Okay? And I think we're just about out of time, so thanks for coming. Especially